Okay, we should be ready to begin. In our discussion yesterday, we discussed the subject of libertarianism, and most people agreed that it's a political philosophy. So people gave their different thoughts on what libertarianism was. I don't know about each of you, but I got the impression that most people have a very negative view of what libertarianism is. It seems to be associated with bad elements of society. And a wrong form of government. Maybe some people might describe it as a selfish ideology. We then went to a definition that I provided, which on the surface sounds very similar to what most people would think libertarianism is. It holds freedom and liberty as primary values. That these would be the most important things that human beings desire. So they asked people what was important to them. And we got a list of things that people felt were important. Just want to label 3: health, finances, and good relationships. And just the last one I want to speak about is not living in fear. We then went to the US framers and saw how they viewed society. How they would create a government. How they would enter into politics. And they spoke about human beings' innate rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property. And when people spoke about what life meant, people spoke about outside entities not controlling them. And someone spoke about rights. And we had a discussion about whether we have rights or whether we have God-given rights. They spoke about the dangers of having God-given or religious rights. So this idea of life, it's obviously separate to liberty. And we really didn't have enough time to pass or to distinguish between the two. So when you look at the definition that we had here for life, you'll see it's very similar to liberty. So I want to suggest we need to do a bit more work on what that word life means. For the moment, we'll just take it literally. That it's not so much about controlling your life, but you have the right to live, to exist. Went on to liberty, to be free from control. And then we spoke about property, or as the framer said, happiness. And we defined what property meant. And we didn't discuss it in detail because we've done that in previous presentations. But we mentioned John Locke, the English philosopher. We had a slight distraction with the parable about the rich person and camels. And when we spoke about property rights, people often get nervous about amassing wealth. And as you know, whether you're rich or poor, will have very little impact on the life of someone living thousands of miles away. And we spoke about God's system of, we'll call it governance, to deal with the issue of poverty. And it's pretty comprehensive because it deals with social issues and religious issues. Today, in this movement, there's an expectation that each of us should be paying a religious tithe. There's no expectation that we would pay a social tithe. Unless you live in a country that doesn't have a social welfare system. And most countries already have those things in place, so we don't normally pay the second tithe or the social tithe. And we didn't speak about offerings. and there is no fixed number. But ancient Israel used to give around 5%. So all in all, that's around 25%. And for most people in most countries, you'll know that that's what most governments take, around 25% of your salary. And if you just change religion to education, you see that most countries across the world come up with a very similar number to God. And we finished off by reading the passage from the Great Controversy. And it's chapter 29, The Origins of Evil. So I just want to read that passage again. It's the third paragraph. It's the second half of the third paragraph. No, it's not. It's the fourth paragraph, sorry. I'll read the whole passage. The law of love being the foundation of the government of God, the happiness of all created beings depended upon their perfect accord with its great principles of righteousness. God desires from all his creatures the service of love, the homage that springs from an intelligent appreciation of his character. He takes no pleasure in a forced allegiance, and to all God grants freedom of will that they may render God voluntary service. So if you spend any time thinking about that passage after the presentation, I'm guessing you came to the conclusion that what is this law? This law of love, what does it actually mean? Because in the passage, Ellen White doesn't actually define it. And neither did we in our class. But what this passage says is that God's government is founded on the law of love. And our happiness depends upon our adherence to that law. So the more you comply or follow the law of love, the happier you will be. And God desires voluntary service. And God grants freedom of will to each and every one of us. And the more you think about these different elements, you'll see that they can be in tension. With what we see, and often how we think we should operate in this world and the world above. So I want to read some thoughts from, I guess it's a manuscript of sorts. It gives a bit of historical background on the subject of libertarianism. Libertarianism is the heir to the 19th century ideology and this ideology or idea was called classical liberalism back then. We've all heard of the Whig Party, I think. How would you describe who and what the Whig Party were? Just a simple explanation of who the Whig Party were. Anybody? Who do we think that, who would we identify them as?
Liberals.
Brendan?
Liberals, I think.
Okay, so Brendan says liberals.
Modern word for it. I think that's the modern word for it.
Mm-hmm. Were they good or bad? Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Catherine? Good. So today we'd call them liberals, and I think that they're good. Okay, so we'll stop there. Indeed, its roots, which is liberalism, its roots can be traced back to the earliest discussions of the nature of freedom in Western philosophy. So the liberalism or libertarianism that we speak of today you can trace its roots back to the 19th century Whig Party. but you can also trace it back to a much earlier period when Western philosophers were speaking about the subject of freedom. So that should already tell us that the whole subject of libertarianism or liberty is about discussing the nature of freedom. Any questions or thoughts? Are we okay? You looking worried, Josephine, or just thinking? But Josephine saying, do I mean the true nature of freedom? I'm not sure what that means, but I'm just going to say yes. Because you seem to imply that there's a false freedom, or sorry? So there is a true freedom, but there's an opposite to that. I'm just repeating what Josephine just said. What would you call that opposite of freedom? You're just going to call it false freedom. When I spoke about love, you didn't say what kind of love was that. You didn't say, is that true love? Sorry? Love that comes from the heart. I don't think love comes anywhere but from the heart. Where does hatred come from? Thoughts of murder. Sorry? It all comes from the heart. Okay. So it's about this idea of freedom. What would we call it? I think Ellen White uses a word in the passage that we read. Yes. To everybody, what does God grant?
Free will.
Free will?
Free will.
So we call it free will. And what does free will mean?
Do what you want.
Do what you want. Is that how we describe free will? Do what you want?
Choice.
Choice? Right?
Choice to do right.
Okay. So I'll just leave it as choice so we can just choose. That funny? Oh, don't worry. Oh, sorry. Okay, so the ability to choose, that's what free will is. Anything else? I was hoping that we might be able to just add one more word, because when I'm going to go ahead. Because when we read what they want, no, not what they want, what they're grappling with, the issue that they're grappling with. You'll see it's the same issue that we're grappling with. And it's connected to free will. Okay. At its most general, it embraces the view that humans should be treated as autonomous individuals. So what does autonomous mean? If you're autonomous, if you're not sure, maybe someone can pull out a dictionary. Sorry?
Controls itself.
It controls itself.
Independent, self-governed.
I'll put control itself.
Independent.
Independent. Anything else?
Self-reliant.
So we're going to see, we're not going to discuss it, but when I say we're going to see, we all know that Ellen White's going to describe, let's call it the universe, in the following way. So autonomous, the first part really gives it all away, the auto. Which means it runs by itself. We okay with that? It runs by, which is what we've said here. It controls itself. It's independent. It's self-reliant. Most scientists, I guess all atheists, and some religionists would describe it this way. Obviously, if you're an atheist or a scientist, you wouldn't use these words, the ones I'm going to use. So Ellen White will say the universe is not it's not like a clock that God winds up at the very beginning puts on the shelf and it just unwinds all of it all on its own. So she'll say without God's continual input, management, interference, the universe wouldn't function. So I think we've all either read or if you haven't read that statement, it shouldn't be unfamiliar to you. That the universe isn't on autopilot, basically. And because many of us acknowledge that as a given, if we were to suggest that we are independent, that people would say that's just not true. Without God, you just cease to exist. And yet, we acknowledge that we have free will, which is either the same or really close to being an autonomous individual, which by definition must mean that you stand independent and separate from God. And any comments or any thoughts on that? I'm assuming you all agree, even if you don't understand, because that's just the spirit of prophecy statement, free will. And it's not complicated to know what that means. Because in the passage, she uses the word voluntary. Which means it's all you. You're making the decision. You're the one that's in control. And these philosophers just use a slightly different term called autonomous individual. And I don't know what the word individual means. But I guess it means something along the lines that we're all separate units. Unique, maybe. And we are all not only able, but it's our right to take care of ourselves, to be independent. And this is where people begin to get nervous, people like yourselves. If we all just did our own thing, society would collapse. So the only point I'm making now is that these people were wrestling with the same issues that we're wrestling with. And then people who catch the idea or it excites them, they get interested in the subject. They want to implement that into their lives. into their community, into their society. And then it enters into the political realm. So we said that humans should be treated as autonomous individuals So tell me if you agree with this. This is what you would want. Free to make their own decisions. So Josephine's put a big yes to that. You want to be free to make your own decisions. Those decisions are regarding how to live your life and how to determine your own salvation. Without being constrained to act against your own wishes. So who would disagree with that? Besides Graham. So you said it's loaded. So Marilyn said it's a loaded statement. I thought it's really simple and straightforward and not loaded. Go ahead.
It depends on the education that you've received.
So
Or the school.
it depends upon one's worldview, how they've been inculcated or educated through their lives. Graham, you put your hand up.
The phrase to determine your own salvation.
So Graham struggles with the idea of determining one's salvation. So the sentence was, determine your own salvation without being constrained against your will. You don't like that?
You have a set of rules.
So you're not sure how it works practically? Anybody want to help? How does that work?
Believe what you want. And
Believe what you want.
and no external force bearing down on you, forcing you one way or the other.
There's no external entity forcing you to, what word are you?
Believe one way or the
Forcing
other.
you to believe one thing or another thing.
Good to make decisions,
Oh.
but you need information.
Sorry?
I'm happy to make decisions, but I want a lot of information before I make that decision.
So you want information, but you don't want to be forced. So an example then, Graham. This has its roots in the earliest times of Western philosophy. So we'll break into that history, not the earliest bit, but the middle bit. and the Inquisition. So the church says you need to be saved because we know what's good for you. And 70 years is just like a blink of an eye compared to eternity. And we know there's only one way to be saved, which is our way. And because we know more than you, we will encourage you to follow religion or salvation in our way. So I guess that's too sort of obvious for you. So you tell me what your concern is.
Where
Okay.
we will do the same, but without punishment.
So Graham suggests that we do the same, but without punishment. So when you say without punishment, do you mean, you don't mean without threat? We threaten. And do you think that's right or wrong to threaten people? Because we just heard a moment, education, which we'd all, I think, agree with.
I'll change threaten to warn. Change threaten to warn.
To warn. So do you see warning as constraint against your wish?
My trouble was that you could be saved in your own way. That's what I grappled with that sentence.
So Graham's issue is that you could read into this sentence that people can be saved in their own way. So without being silly about it, because I want to try to treat this respectfully. What other way is there to be saved if not your way? Because you're here today and just talking about your local community. I don't know what the numbers are at the moment, but you stand in opposition to, say, 20 million people. So you're saying, I don't agree with your version of salvation. I'm going to do my own version. So you separate from Adventism, who had separated from Protestantism, who had separated from Catholicism. And all of those people are saying, we'll do salvation our own way. Whatever the source material is that whatever the education they're going to receive or the information they're going to receive. Isn't that what you're saying, that you're going to do it your way?
Only that they all can't be right.
So Graham's argument is that they can't all be right. Sure, they can't all be right. How do you know you're right? let me rephrase the question. Does it matter if you're right? Isn't what matters the fact that you can choose? Not whether you're right or wrong. Being right is nice and being wrong isn't so nice. But the thing that they're grappling with is your right to choose what you want. Not to choose what's wrong, but to choose what is right according to your understanding. Yeah. Okay. So we're all in agreement up to this point with these Western philosophers, I mean. Of course, this is not to suggest that their decisions will invariably conduce to the greatest happiness. Nor that they will never be hurtful to others. So I'll read the sentence again and tell me what you think that means. This is a bit of an academic paper, so the language isn't so user-friendly. Of course, this is not to suggest that their decisions will invariably conduce to their greatest happiness, nor that they will never be hurtful to others. How many people are being spoken of here? Let's do that first. 2 people? Did you get? So there's 2 people. We'll call it groups. Who are the 2 groups? First one? Good. You?
Those you hurt.
And others. So you said the others who you hurt. Others, but it also said the you whom.
Happy. You'll get happiness.
So Brendan said you'll get happiness and others will not get happiness.
I'll have to read it.
Before I read it again, did anybody get something different? Catherine, you. No, the you. So there's no guarantee you'll make the right decision for yourself. I'm going to put that hurt yourself and others. Oh, others.
There's no guarantee you won't hurt.
And the others hurt them.
Okay.
So the objective is not to hurt anybody. That's the objective. But whatever decision you make, there's no guarantee that you won't hurt yourself or you won't hurt others. the others is an obvious one, because we call that selfishness. But what I think that's interesting about their observation, which touches on the point that Graham made when it spoke about salvation. So there's no guarantee that the decision that you make will be to your, it says greatest happiness. We'll swap that to salvation. So your plan of salvation may actually be completely wrong. But their argument is that their point is they're not trying to suggest that it always leads to salvation. But their argument is that you think it leads to your salvation, and no one should prevent you from pursuing your dreams. Okay?
I just needed to wait for you
Yep.
to finish the extra sentence and it would have said it for me.
Great. So, Graham, when we read this second sentence, it all falls into place. Rachel?
I was just going to say, whatever the choice, it'll impact yourself or others.
So that's what's important, that whatever decision you make, it will impact people. And that impact, there's no guarantee that it's always going to end up positive. For you or for others. They go on. But as long as these decisions were made freely, and these decisions do not directly harm other people, the only option open to others is to try to divert them from their chosen path is moral persuasion and not force. So does someone want to just put that into a simple phrase or sentence? I'll read it again. So this is a continuation of the same thought. But so long as their decisions were made freely and do not directly harm their neighbors, the only option open to others in trying to divert them from their chosen path is moral persuasion and not force. Rachel?
Simply, you have a right to choose of your own decision. But if your choice is another, then there has to be intervention.
So we have a right to choose our own path. But if that path hurts someone, or if that decision hurts someone else, there has to be an intervention. That's what you took from that. Anyone else? Chris? I know, I saw the hands.
I'm totally clear the passage in the head.
Okay, the passage isn't clear. So let's go with someone paraphrasing it as best as they think. So are you okay just to paraphrase that? So don't try to explain what it means, just paraphrase. Right?
These ever make their own choices. But if others disagree with that, the option for those others is to convince that person not to force them.
So Catherine gave a synopsis or a summary of a paraphrase of what she thought that sentence meant. So Chris, did that make sense?
Yeah. Not sure what to do with it.
Okay, so you're not sure. You had your hand up?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure now?
I understand what it means.
Okay.
And yeah, there's no. It just your option is to dialogue with the person who's made the decision.
Okay, so the option is, if you don't agree with them, the option is to dialogue with them, to argue, but not to force. Sorry. Go ahead.
Isn't this basic parenting?
So isn't this basic parenting?
Or did the child make a choice?
I assume that's a rhetorical statement. You're saying this is obvious. So the thing is, it seems so obvious when we talk about it like this. I'm not speaking directly to you and your life experience. But how many times have you, and so many of you, not done this? One second. Go ahead.
I haven't always dialogued with the child.
So you haven't always dialogued with children. When you haven't dialogued, what have you done? So you're forced, using their words. So you've asked them to make a choice unconditionally or with consequences. So consequences are force. So whether it's children or not, I think most of us have fallen foul of this. Catherine, you wanted to make a point before, and I just asked you to paraphrase. So Catherine was going to use Graham as an example.
So he's on.
So Graham has his views of salvation, and Catherine doesn't agree with those views of salvation.
All I can do is try to persuade him. I can't coerce, threaten.
All Catherine can do is try to persuade and not force. So remember, this is a philosophy. This is an ideology. And all of that has to be transferred now into a society or a societal setting. So these people weren't ignorant of the complexity and difficulty of doing that. Just like we're not ignorant of it. But often when this subject is brought up, people respond immediately with but. And the but is always some kind of scenario where it would shoot liberty, it would kneecap liberty, it would injure it. It would seem to me that that's not a very good way to approach life. It would seem to me that we should view things in a very idealistic way, a very perfect way. And then realism would set in. And then we would have to work out how we can apply this perfection or this idealistic ideology. But often we don't give any time to it because we say it will never work. It's in English they'd say pie in the sky. It's impossible. So why would we even consider it? Any questions, or I'll read on? Okay. It is for this reason that libertarians are so distrustful of government. Not because they fear the behavior of all collectives, what does that mean? Not because they fear the behavior of all collectives. What does that mean?
They're not worried about society as people.
So they're not worried about society. Or groups. That's not what their worry is. This is what their fear is. So tell me if you agree with this. Tell me if you agree with this. But because governments rest on law, that's true. That's the only purpose of a government, really. It's the next bit that you may not agree with. And all law is ultimately based on the threat of force. So I don't know if you agree. So I'll read that whole sentence. Based upon what we read earlier, remember persuasion and not force. It is for this reason that libertarians are so distrustful of government, not because they fear the behavior of all collectives, but because governments rest on law and all law is ultimately based on the threat of force. So do you agree with that statement either intellectually or perhaps even emotionally? Maybe you say, that's me. So the first half of the sentence is about your emotional response. And the second one is a statement of fact, whether you agree with that fact or not. I'm not saying it's a correct fact. I'm just saying that it's worded as a fact. What do we think? Agree or disagree? Do we agree with the factual bit? All governments rest on law, and all law ultimately is based upon threats.
Yes.
Yep. So Brendan said yes. Anybody different? Okay. Oh, you don't agree. So Catherine doesn't agree. Tell us why you don't agree. That all law is ultimately based on the threat of force. Because of the quote that we heard about the law of love. So when it uses the word law here, so yesterday we did that. Whatever the law of love is, this symbol was meant to represent the word tension. It's in opposition to this idea of forced obedience. And forced obedience, someone said, I think it was Molly said, this is law. So in this passage that we're reading, all government rests on law, and all laws are ultimately based upon the threat of force. Which one are they talking about? The left or the right? One or two? So you said if the context is on earth, which it is, then it's number two. And then Catherine says she actually agrees with that. Okay, so I think we're all in agreement with what they're saying. Remember, this is how you build up, I guess, a working model of how a society would run. That you have a clear understanding of what your belief system is, or your philosophy, your worldview. And then you have to work out something that works. Okay, all law seeks to alter behavior. Either by preventing people from acting in a way that in the absence of law, they would freely choose to engage in, or by inducing them to behave in manners foreign to their more agreeable wishes. So all that simply says is that all law seeks to change your behavior. And it does that by preventing you acting in a certain way. So if there was no law, you would act in a certain way. And if there is law, now you change your behavior. And it induces or compels you to behave in a manner that, or in a way that you don't agree with. These modifications in behavior are in every instance brought about by the government's threat to use force or its actual use. So you want to behave a certain way. There's a law that says you're going to behave in a different way. And the way the law makes you change your behavior is how? It's not the law itself, because it uses the word government.
Threats.
Sorry?
Threats.
Threats. It forces you to do something. Either by the threat of force or by its implementation, one of the two. Doesn't care. And this libertarian philosophy says that that model is fundamentally wrong. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just acknowledges that it's not the right way to do things. And the question I think each of us needs to grapple with is if we agree with that. If we agree that because we're autonomous beings, individuals, not beings, autonomous individuals, with free will, who have ideas of wrong and right, based on our education, that we think the proper way to live is for others to persuade us to change rather than forcing us to change. So I don't know if you agree with that idea. Before you put all the buts in. Because there are some buts, we know that. Buts are examples where you think this just doesn't work. It's not practical. But separate to the buts, if you agree with this worldview, that it's right, or whether you think it's fundamentally wrong at some point in their argument. Brendan?
So I think it's right.
So Brendan agrees with their view and their conclusion.
So if
Go ahead.
so government is lazy because it doesn't explain. It just says do this.
So the government is lazy because it doesn't explain, it just commands you to do things.
If I think of God's government, isn't that the model of explanation, not force?
So Brendan's comment is that God's government is based upon explanation, but not force.
Just
Mhm.
I'll rattle it out, that's all.
Okay. Josephine?
To me, I think if I see it as a deterrent, it might be easier to swallow rather than.
So Josephine thinks that using the word deterrent is easier to swallow. Go ahead.
Or a deterrent, and then I don't speak about the force.
Tell me the difference between a deterrent and a threat.
You have to enforce it. It's just there as a guide.
So a deterrent is not it's not a what? You're saying that deterrents don't have any force behind them.
You don't have to do it, but you can say you can use the consequences. And but a deterrent, you have a choice still.
So a deterrent, you're almost making it sound like education.
I like the word deterrent. Yes.
So I don't know, put that, maybe I have to put that in a dictionary, but I think you've softened deterrent an awful lot. Sorry, Josephine, you're speaking to yourself. Because no one can hear you. Speak now. Before you, deterrent is a thing that discourages or is intended to discourage someone from doing something. And you're saying that's not a threat. Able or intended to deter. And deter means, what do you think deter means? Anybody, what does the word deter mean?
Try and stop.
Stop?
Yeah, the military uses it as like a way to say force.
I think the word deter just means to stop, and deterrent comes from deter. It basically means to stop doing things. Go ahead. What's the point that she has?
It can, there can be a deterrent. I was thinking they brought in a law that you had to wear a bike helmet years ago. And my mother made the choice, rather than wear the bike helmet and mess up my $50 hairdo from the hairdresser, I won't ride the bike at all. And she gave up the bike. So we do have, it's a deterrent, and we do have another choice.
This helmet thing, we're just talking online. So there's a law.
That you have to buy a helmet.
That's not a deterrent.
Deterred by that and made another choice.
But there's no, it's not a deterrent. The law says if you ride the bike, you have to wear a helmet. And your mother said to you what?
She chose not to ride the bike anymore, and she gave it up because she didn't want to, the helmet.
Sure, but that's not a deterrent.
Well, I sort of think that Josephine's saying that there's another choice. You know, it's not just yes or no, you can have other choices.
In the example you gave, the government says bike,
The law
helmet,
is- Yeah, that's right.
then you say, I'm not going to ride a bike anymore. And the reason you're not riding a bike is, as we read, the law changes your behavior and threatens you with force if you don't comply with that change of behavior.
Change her behaviour. She stopped riding the bike
Yeah.
and she went and got a license and drove a car.
So I'm going to read a little bit more. Thus, fines, imprisonments, and even death itself are attached to engaging in certain actions or dissuading us from doing others. This aspect of law is seldom or if ever considered. Great.
Talk about buts.
So Graham wants to speak about a but. So seeing as we're coming to the end of our study, we'll say yes.
Trying to save me.
So Catherine is trying to save Graham.
But as soon as she mentions, I can't be saved any other way.
So she says, you can't be saved any other way except Catherine's way.
force.
So Graham says that that's not force. That is force. And you said something about public evangelism.
Any evangelist.
So we shouldn't be doing any kind of evangelism. Okay, but these people were clever. They said you can do moral persuasion. So moral persuasion is fine, but force isn't.
Discussion's good.
So you can browbeat people, no problem. But you can't force them. And you see this guilt tripping, if I can use that phrase, as force. Go ahead.
I see it the same as law.
So you see it the same as law. So if there was a law that says speed limit is 50, but if you don't keep 50, we're not going to do anything about it. Would you classify that as law? Okay, so Graham's not sure. So technically, you could have laws that aren't enforced. But if you have a law that by design has no enforcement attached to it, who would obey that law? Because it has no ability to change your behavior. And it ever so subtly shifts from the concept of law to education. So there's no problem sitting 16-year-olds in front of a TV and showing them all the bloodshed that happens in car accidents if you don't wear a seatbelt. But that's different to punishing people for not wearing a seatbelt. According to them. I like it or okay. We've come to the end of our time, over time. So what I wanted to do in these two presentations is not to make you all libertarians. It wasn't even to do an analysis of what's going on in America or many other countries in the world. We can't escape words, at least I can't. So if I asked you to, identify who you are, you can only do that by words. And the one that we've been guided to or gravitated to is the term radical feminists. And I've tried to pay attention, perhaps even try to unpackage what, or to explore what that term means in past studies. And because the term libertarian is used so widely now in the press, and many people in the movement have discussed that term, almost always in a negative sense. I guess the question that I want to ask each of us is, what would you identify yourself as? Because you can't just say Christian, and you can't say Seventh-day Adventist. You can't say a humanitarian. It's really difficult, I think, to come up with a, either a single word or a little phrase to describe who and what you are. And I'm certainly not trying to foist upon you to accept the label of being a libertarian. But what I wanted to do is begin a conversation to discuss what libertarianism really is about. Not to come to a conclusion of how it would work in this world, because it's complicated. I know that. But to try to understand amongst ourselves how we're supposed to function and operate. So I'll give one example, then I'll close. We won't even give your thoughts to it. We don't have pastors in our movement, but we have full-time workers. And I would suggest they're the closest that we get to pastors. And Ellen White says, we're trying to create an atmosphere in our church, a culture, not atmosphere. And to set the right tone, any pastor who eats meat should be fired. If you eat meat, it's wrong to be supported by tithe. So I don't know what you think about that. And I don't know where you think the movement is today on that subject. But if you've made any change from that position, that you say, I don't believe that, then you have to ask yourself, why? What steps have you taken to get from that worldview to the current one that you hold? that's just one example of many of how you view the world now. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us online. And I want to thank all of you for participating. We're all here on Sabbath morning. And everyone who's here joining us, if you want to put your camera on and say a quick hello to everybody here, please feel free to do that. And I'm going to just turn our camera around. So please feel free to put your videos on if you want to. So you can see our little group.